Welcome to the channel, everyone. My name is Joe Buskins. I am a full-time fishing guide, second generation professional boat builder. My family has been fishing and building boats on the northern Gulf Coast for over 8 generations. So today we are here in the boat shop talking about fiberglass fabric selection. Now this is a follow-up video to our previous one where we were learning how to fiberglass over plywood. And these are going to be some in-depth tutorials. I'm going to be answering a lot of questions. We're not just skimming over this. I will be talking in depth about what is the best glass per your application. So we've torn all of our sample pieces. What I've got is some chop strand mat. And if you pan over here, we've got all the other pieces of the woven roving, 6-ounce cloth, 90-degree biaxial, and some more of the CSM chop strand mat. So we've got some nice sample areas to work on. We've got a nice flat surface. Going to kind of be a example of, like, say if you're fiberglassing the bottom of a skiff or the side or a floor, for example. And then we got almost like a stringer section. Now obviously this has been fiberglassed, and once again, if you're new to the channel, you may not have seen the previous episode where we fiberglassed that and just showed you how to fiberglass over plywood. So if that's interesting to you, feel free to check it out. But the CSM, or the chop strand mat, is going to be one of the most common materials. You can use it if you just had a plywood surface and you want to seal it or weatherproof it. You could also use the 6-ounce, the real fine finishing cloth. Well, what we're going to do, I've got a pan of resin and we've got all kind of materials laid out, and we're going to do this real world. I'm going to show you what series you can stack these. Some of these materials you don't want to use them layer after layer. Some materials are okay to stack layer after layer. So you guys may have seen me in some previous episodes use some blue tape to clean excess fibers and hairs off that roller. We're going to be using a roller in conjunction with a brush to apply the resin. Now sometimes in some videos, I've seen a lot of videos on YouTube where people are using brushes to apply a lot of material. And yes, you can do that, but it's kind of slow. I like a roller in conjunction with a brush. You can see I've got a nice uniform loading on that roller. And what we're going to start with is probably the most common or kind of old school of materials. And I hate to say old school, but a lot of boats have been built using woven roving in the 18-ounce and 1-ounce mat. Now this is crucially important. Aside from we've already got our surface has been sealed and primed with resin, and our room temperatures and everything are in working range of fiberglass, in general around 70 degrees plus or minus. You always want to start with mat first. It has a really good properties as far as bonding to surfaces, and it holds a lot of resin, which really helps it adhere. You never ever want to start with roving. It does not bond initially well at all. It's got a lot of strength. So the two together, you've kind of got the glue and you've got the strength, and together they work really well. Now one thing you also want to remember is when you're laminating, you'll notice I've torn this mat a little bit wider than the woven roving. So when we apply it in this corner, the mat is going to extend out a little bit further than the roving would. And so what we're going to do is just wet that really nice and thoroughly as a base coat. Now remember, if you didn't see the previous episode, priming your resin, priming the wood with resin is very, very important. So we're putting plenty of resin down. We're going to split this panel with the mat, half on one side, half on the other, and we're going to work that in with the roller. And you can see how easily that lays down with that nice radius corner that we did earlier. That's also important, is being sure you radius the corners. The preparation work before you start is such a big part of a quality job. And again, y'all, our family has been here on the Gulf Coast since the 60s building boats, and we've built hundreds of them, and a lot of them were built with the mat and roving. So it's a little bit older technology, but it's still good technology. So we've got our first base coat of mat down. We've got plenty of resin in it, and we're just going to take our woven roving and lay it right there in the corner. And we're going to saturate this again. Now bear in mind that this material has binders inside of it that have to kind of be melted. You'll notice this stuff for a minute, it'll kind of act like it does not want to lay down or conform. And as you put the resin in and work it, it'll get more malleable. But that's where working two different types of materials really come in. The roving's super strong, the mat's like a glue, and it's very conforming. So you really need to use the two together, and you can completely, say, glass in stringer sections, for example, using this. And it gets more agreeable as it works its way in there and you let it really soak. But you'll notice the woven roving, it kind of wants to pull away a little bit and wants to come loose from the base material. This is where another layer of mat comes in. So we always finish with mat. We never finish with a bare layer of woven roving. It just doesn't work good. Matter of fact, you can see, even though it's saturated, this is wanting to pull away. So the trick to that is you come over that with another layer of mat, and you notice it extends beyond the roving. So we're going to saturate this once more really well, and it'll help hold that material in there. Now sometimes you may have to come back and put 2 layers of mat. Some manufacturers make softer fiberglass than others. Some is more malleable, conforms better, lays down nicer. And you can do this, I would say, like if you were putting in a stringer, you could do a matte roving. Probably be plenty. You don't want to put too much glass on at one time, or else it'll build heat within itself and it causes an exothermic reaction, which means it gets hot when it's cured. So what we're going to have to do, you can see this roving here is still wanting to pull away a little bit. So what would you do in that case? You say, oh man, I've done everything I know how to do. I put 1 layer. It's okay to come and put, we're going to tear another piece of mat. And that's what's cool about mat, is you can just tear it by hand. I like to feather the edges. And what we're going to do is come right over here. We're going to start here and we're going to roll up and over, and that's going to help hold that edge. So the way the roving's acting is probably part of the reason why currently most boat manufacturers and a lot of people that are doing repair projects are going to tend toward the biaxial, the 1708. It actually works really, really nice. I like it a lot. But as we put the second layer on, we're going to bend it right over the top of the stringer section. And it puts a nice cosmetic finish on there, and it helps to make that roving lay down. Very good. I'm going to work that in there nice and tight. Now, as far as the amount of resin you're going to want to put in there, you want it saturated, but you don't want the resin to be puddling or pulling up. All right, just like that. Now, you guys may have seen in the previous episode the little hard rollers, little bubble busters, groove rollers. Really, really cool about using them to work out any excess air out of the laminate. Sorry about the squeaks there, y'all. That one's noisy. See, I've got another. Whoa. There it is. That's the one we used in the previous episode. That's a little larger diameter one there. And you can just use it to smooth out those surfaces. Work it just like that. Very good. And you can see the mat helped pull that roving down, and you no longer see that edge through there. So that's not bad, and that would be pretty typical. Again, you could absolutely use that if you were glassing in a stringer or a structural reinforcement. The mat's really good at bonding. The roving's got the strength. So now what would you do, for example, if we wanted to use some of the 1808, which 1808 is considered a biaxial But remember, 1808 is at a 90 degree, so it's running 90 degrees straight up and down, straight across. Now, we use it when we're laminating a hull because it distributes the stresses that are put upon the hull by waves and flexing and whatnot. And if you use the 45 degree, which is 1708, and the 90 degree, you're spreading those loads out in every direction. If you were to try to use this in a hard corner, if you think about it, some of the fibers are running this way and some of them are running this way. So when you run this in a corner, the fibers have to bend. It's a sharp corner that they have to turn. Half of the fibers are going to be going across the corner and half of them are going to be running lengthwise. So you don't have all of the fibers running across the joint, which is important for strength. It's going to be less workable than the 1708. And that is one of those things when you're ordering in a catalog and you may say, well, man, what in the world difference is the 1708 and the 1808, and why would I want to use one versus the other? And basically it comes down to, if you want to really distribute the loads or forces exerted upon something, you could go a 1708, 1808, 1708, 1808. But honestly, most people don't do that. And you can see though, this has the CSM made into the back of it. And it will still conform as long as you have a nice radius in that corner. And it is still very strong. There's nothing wrong with it. But personally, if I'm going to only have one fabric in the shop, it would be the 1708. The 45 degree is generally going to be more workable. Sometimes we will use a brush to dab some excess resin into the corners. And remember, when you're working glass, whether it's matte or roving, don't worry if it doesn't go transparent immediately. A lot of times it's going to take a few minutes for the resin to really work its way in there. So you guys have seen me use some of the 1708 before. The 1708 is better about conforming. And the 1708 again is the material that runs at a 45 degree angle. And say, for example, we could come right here and I may be inclined to use the 1708 going over this bend. It's going to bend a little bit easier and overlap, and that would help us cap this stringer. So what we're going to do is get a little more resin. Now generally guys, when we're mixing fiberglass resin, you don't want to mix up huge batches at a time. A lot of times we'll go like 1 pint or 1 quart at a time. I'm almost done with that pan and I want to saturate this. So what I'm going to do is work out all the old resin out of that brush and work out some of that old resin out of this roller and give it a minute for the resin to melt the binders in that glass. 1708 though, again, has become one of my favorites. And if I had to have 2 materials in my shop, and only 2, it would be the matte, chop strand matte, and the 1708 biaxial. They're the most universal, and I just enjoy working with them more. And it's just, you can already see that it has a tendency to want to lay down a little bit easier. The 45 degree angles, it's kind of like when we're going over waves. If we're in the boat out in our big 29, for example, and you got big waves coming towards you and you go straight at them, it can be a very abrupt and very sharp movement. But if you turn 45 degrees to the wave as you're going over, the boat has a softer motion. And that's the way this glass is to me. Instead of the glass having to bend at a harsh 90 degree angle to the corner or the edge, it's a softer or slower or easier transition. So we've moved right along, and if you remember, we had the 90 degree 1808 in that corner, and I'm going to hit that with a little bubble buster roller, and then we followed that with the 1708 over the top, which seems to conform better overall in my opinion. Now what we have here is a hard seam, You can kind of zoom in there. You can see right here where the 1708 laps over the 1808. This would be a great time to use a little bit of matte to blend those edges once again. The matte kind of helps transitions. It's very good at conforming. It's also really, really good at cosmetic surfaces. It kind of creates a nice smooth surface. And again, it does hold more resin than most of your other fabrics, which helps it smooth out and be a little better conforming. The downside is that it's not terribly strong. So we're gonna go ahead, and now this would be a very strong stringer section or other structural member, and that is where your biaxials and your woven roving is gonna really work the best. I'm gonna put another piece of mat on here. Now again, if you guys are new to the channel and you're just finding us, we have well over 100 videos on the channel. Matter of fact, the big Buskins 2900, this was a multi-year project that we built that boat from scratch. And we used a lot of fiberglass, mostly the 1708 biaxial and the chop strand mat. Now again, we're doing the same thing. You can kind of see where there was a hard edge here, but the mat really smooths it out and makes it look nice. Now here would be a good time to pick up your brush, and in these hard corners, sometimes we will come back and we will apply a little additional resin and do a little bit of, again, what my family always called dabbing. That was kind of the name. I don't know if that's a technical term or not. And then at this point, we are nearing completion of what we would typically put on. Now do remember, like I said, you can't put on too many layers. I would say probably 3 or 4 layers of any of these fabrics at any one time would be about the maximum. And a lot of times we may only do 2 layers at a time. We may do a mat and a roving, and a mat and roving, or we may do 2 biaxials. You'll also notice when I did these, we overlap the layers by about 1 inch or so, and that is going to give the material a lot more strength. You want to overlap those materials anytime you have a joint or a section. If you butt them end to end or just together, there's going to be a weak point there, and that's not what we want. So we'll put our little roller in our acetone bucket, and we've got another sample piece over here. So what we've done with this flat panel, and again, this would be as if you had built a wooden skiff, or you had something you wanted to surface and just wanted to be sealed, but you're not really needing a whole lot of strength. We've taken this plywood, I had primed it previously, and with the 6-ounce finishing cloth, now this is the trick. You're gonna just wet the surface, but it's not gonna be an awful lot of resin. You're basically gonna wet that surface. Get over here. Sorry for walking back and forth so much, y'all. It's a little tricky sometimes videoing this stuff. Building boats and repairing boats is one thing, but trying to video all of it. So I'm gonna put a nice coat of resin down, but not go crazy. Just a good base amount. And we're gonna pick up our little 6-ounce. So we are back at the 6-ounce mat, or the finishing cloth rather. And we've got our flat panel of marine plywood, and we've put a good base coat of resin down. But this stuff works really good with epoxy because it's malleable, but again, it's kind of tricky. It'll slide all over the place. So what I'm gonna do is start at one end, and you just have to kind of place it with a gloved hand just delicately. And you can see it's already kind of trying to torque around and move. And generally what you're gonna wanna do is work, probably have a piece bigger than what you think you're gonna need. All right, so I'm gonna slide right back over there, and the next tool that we're gonna be using is a squeegee for this stuff, is a flexible blade. So you can see how quickly it's gone transparent. And what it's doing is it's just basically taking the resin out of the base, that primer coat. And I'm just going to use this squeegee blade and we're going to flatten it out. Try to work a little bit of resin into it. It's actually quite all right on the first coat if it's not just completely saturated. This stuff has some unusual working characteristics in that if you put too much resin on it, it'll wrinkle really badly and actually kind of float up off of the surface, which is not what you want. So it's kind of contrary, and I've seen people, one of the biggest no-nos with working with this is putting too much resin on. So the trick with this material is to get it on there and work it out so that it's kind of semi-transparent. Now, we do have a little dry spot there. Logan can kind of zoom in on and show. And if that's the case, it is okay to take your brush and apply a little more resin. You could do that with a roller as well, but not a ton. You don't want to just saturate it like you would some of the other materials. And I'm going to again use the squeegee blade to kind of move. And you can see now that material has gone transparent, which is what you want. Resist the temptation to put too much resin on this, because it will float and wrinkle and you will wonder, what in the world have I done wrong? So if you notice here, if you get kind of low, you can see the material still has quite a bit of texture on it. There's not a lot of resin floating on the surface. And for the first coat, that is how you want it. It's gonna have to cure. I would leave this material to cure overnight. And basically all it's doing is putting a nice uniform surface on that plywood. It's gonna seal it. The 6 ounce is excellent if you're doing like a stitching glue, like a little epoxy over plywood skiff. Matter of fact, come on over here, I'll show you guys. Now, obviously, again, if you're new to the channel, this is one of our 19 footers we built a few years ago. That's a 100% composite boat. But here's a little 15-foot wood and epoxy skiff, and then here is another done in stitching glue. And we used epoxy resin with the 6 ounce finishing cloth on that using the same method. So we're gonna go back over here and I'm gonna do one more just little quick rundown of the materials. Just remember, matte is probably your most common and really, really good at bonding or sealing. You can use it for sealing plywood as well. The 1708 is one of my favorites. It's got the matte on the back and the 45-degree weave, and it's very malleable, very strong, and very readily available. The woven roving is used in conjunction with the matte. You always start with matte. This is super important though. You never want roving to start on the first layer. It does not have good bonding properties at all. Always start with a matte that's slightly wider than the layer of roving you're putting on there. And I would also highly recommend finishing with matte anytime you're working with this material. Now, you guys, when we're working in a shop, obviously we're just flowing right along and we kind of know what we're doing. When we're doing these little demonstration panels for you guys, there's a possibility I missed something, or maybe you guys have a suggestion or a tip, or if there's some content you guys would like to see. Like I said, we are trying to work really hard to grow the channel. We just hit a big milestone yesterday. The channel hit 10,000 subscribers, and I want to thank everyone who's been here since the beginning and is enjoying the content on the channel. But that is going to about wrap up our fiberglass materials and their applications video. You guys let me know if we did a good job. It's Captain Joe here with Island Marine Charters, Fish Bump TV here on YouTube. And as always, we will catch you guys next time.